preview quiz. I'll put the preview quiz in there again. And Jamie, if I get going and some more people join, will you add that so they'll have that?
Yes, I will.
So yeah, I'm going to talk about memorial art. And this is a topic that I've been into for some time. I love to go to cemeteries. And I will say in the beginning that, of course, cemeteries are where deceased people are buried. And some people feel strongly about cemeteries. They're creepy, they're scary, different or sad. So excuse me if I don't talk about those things, because I just love them as a beautiful place where layers and layers and layers of symbols and history converge. And yes, of course, there's deceased people there, but in my opinion, they're deceased, so they don't really mind if we walk on them and look at their beautiful tombstones. So don't get me wrong, it's sad that people are deceased, but it's a beautiful place to look at art. So this is actually a picture I took of a really unique tombstone or monument. And this is the spirit of the deceased person that's depicted coming out of the coffin. Now, obviously, this has had some damage and the lady's arms are broken off and the nose, which is a real shame. So this is just the description of what we're going to look at today. And this is a print from the 1800s. And this was a print you could purchase and then fill in the information about the person who you were memorializing. And so there were a lot of these prints, different ones, black and white, color ones, slightly different styles and designs, especially around the period of Civil War when so many American soldiers were dying on both sides. So we're going to look at a lot of different forms of memorial art today. But this is a quiz about cemetery and tombstone symbols, and there's more quizzes on my website. But if you have time, if you haven't had time to look over that, you don't have to do it beforehand. Did anybody get 10 out of 10? I think there's 10 questions on it. Sometimes I put different numbers of questions. Anybody get a perfect score? Put that in the chat box there if you want. And as always, this is for you to use, but please do not post this on the internet. Now, I will say today, a lot of the pictures I'm using are pictures that I actually took, so it would be okay, but some of them are not. So our essential question is pretty broad today, and it's why do we build memorials or create art for the deceased? And on one level, it's got a pretty obvious answer. It's because we want to remember them, right? That's the obvious answer. But we do so many types of memorial art that, we could delve deeper. Why this type of art and not another type of art? Why do some cultures do it one way and other cultures do another? And then again, why do we even do it? It's a lot of expense and time when maybe, you think, well, maybe that would be spent better somewhere else. And then I could think about them in my mind, right? So you can think about it on different levels. This is actually a picture I took right with the spring before the pandemic. I got to go to Spain and Morocco, and this was in a little booth in their markets. And these are tombstones in Moroccan Muslim society. And this guy's actually carving the information about a deceased person right there. And then here's the different ones you could choose from. Because every culture, society, now and throughout time has memorialized the dead in some way. We just do it in different ways, but then there's some amazing similarities. So what is memorial art? So I'm defining it really broadly. So it could be art objects. So some people say, oh, it's not art, it's a craft, because tombstone carvers, right, maybe following a pattern, maybe it's a craft. Either way, it's interesting to look at, to honor a person, one person or a family, or to commemorate an event like a war. It can be figural art, paintings, graphics, sculptures. It could be architecture, right? And here's just a few examples. Or it could be music. It could be literature. Epitaphs and elegies, it's hard to say, are literary forms of memorial art. It could be performing art. And it serves both our individual memory of a person or event, but also when we're memorializing big events, it's also a part of our collective memory, how we as a society remember events from the past. These are examples very emotional sculptures, two of them from Helsinki, Finland. And wherever I go, I look up a cemetery. This one is especially touching, of the woman bit down crying. And then this was just about the coolest thing ever. And the same artist had done two of these. And this is metal, pieces of metal that have been welded together. And there was this one, and then there was another one with his wings spread. And that was just the coolest thing I've ever seen on a tombstone. And I had to throw that in. Now, I am not going to talk a lot about public memorials, right? Memorials to big events or wars, memorials like the memorials to Holocaust survivors. There's a very famous one in Berlin. Memorials to wars or survivors of war or people who've died in war. I'm not really going to touch on that today. Here's an example in an unlikely place. This is a memory of the Scottish American soldiers in the Civil War. And they've got Abraham Lincoln at the top. And of course, this is a freed slave. So even, some memorials for events you wouldn't think about being at Edinburgh Castle in Scotland are in fact are. So sometimes memorials, public memorials pop up in odd places. And remember, we looked at the sculpture of the Ichthyor centaur in Missouri at the state capitol, right? So that wasn't exactly a memorial, but here's an example of public art that's kind of an odd thing to pop up in Missouri. So let's start with the culture that did it the best, right? The ancient Egyptians, they were all about the memorial art. So I'm starting way back in the past with three cultures. I'm looking at Egypt, Greece, and Rome. And I'm introducing those first because you will see that we have been recycling the symbols and forms of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman memorial art. We are still doing it today. Now, some of those symbols have changed in meaning or lost their meaning. But if you go to a cemetery today and you look around you, you are surrounded by ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and ancient Egypt. Of course, embalming was used in the ancient Egyptians, and some of you may have done that cool thing where you embalm something like the ancient Egyptians with salt is basically what they use. And kids love that. But, after the Egyptians, cremation or burial was used in ancient Greece or Rome, but they didn't embalm the bodies. And embalming came back in vogue, I'll say, in Western society during the Civil War, when they were faced with the problem of how to get the body of a deceased soldier home to bury without, of course, decay occurring. And so since the Civil War, we have expected bodies that are to be buried are embalmed. So here we're doing something that the ancient Egyptians did. We use a slightly different process, different chemicals, but it's still a process that we use. And of course, an obelisk, and go to any cemetery and it's packed full of obelisks, and we don't always recognize that as Egyptian, but it is. This is an Egyptian obelisk that was hauled off to Paris. The ancient Romans took Egyptian obelisks and put them up in Rome, and some are still there today. Of course, the pyramids were tombs, right? They also made huge funeral temples, and then the Valley of the Kings is when they realized that those really obvious tombs, like a pyramid for kings, those were getting robbed, so they started hiding them. And so here is a depiction of Anubis, one of my favorite gods, because when I had a black dachshund and held her ear up, I told her she looked like Anubis. And Anubis is working with a mummy, right? Now, this is how rich people were buried. Average people may have had a less expensive embalming process and were buried, but they certainly didn't get all of these fancy monuments built for them like the wealthy and the ruling class. Now, what's funny, here I'm zapping to the present or near present now. In the 19th century, early 1800s, Egyptomania became the craze. Western culture was obsessed with ancient Egypt. Well, why? Well, first of all, in the very early 1800s, late 1700s, the French armies went to Egypt, and then later the British took over Egypt. And that's when the whole sort of, oh my gosh, look, we rediscovered this ancient culture, and we get these experts in Egyptian history and architecture. So that leaks over into a wider society, and we start reviving Egyptian symbols and architectural forms. But we weren't the first ones to model after Egypt. This is a 1st century BC a tomb of a senator in Rome. And he built a tomb that looked like an Egyptian pyramid. Now, it is located next to a Protestant cemetery that was built, I think they started in the 17 and 1800s. But even the ancient Romans thought, oh my God, the Egyptian funerary monuments are really cool. This is Highgate Cemetery, which was a cemetery that was established. There was a set of these built around London, and what we would think of then as suburban London. You had to take a train to get to them. They were a new style of cemetery. I'll talk about it a little bit later. But this main crypt was styled with Egyptian style columns and Egyptian style entrances to the individual crypts. So they loved Egyptian symbolism. And in fact, the Archbishop of England said, wait a minute. Now, anybody from any faith could be buried in the cemetery. And in fact, Karl Marx, who was an atheist, is buried in the cemetery because you purchased your plot. But the Archbishop of England said, aren't we supposed to be Anglican? Why are we using pagan symbolism? But they did anyway, because it was a popular thing. And here's an obelisk right here on the edge. Here's some Egyptian revival, Egyptomania crypts in Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. And this is a small cemetery, but there are some incredibly wealthy people buried here. And all of these are straight out of ancient Egypt in style. I especially like this one, where they've got the Sphinx on one side, but then they threw in an angel on the other side, kind of hedging their bets there. Here's a symbol. Now, this symbol of the hourglass and the wings is a memento mori symbol. I'll talk about a little bit later. So this was a Christian symbol, but look, they threw an Ouroboros around it, and that was one of the creatures we looked at previously. That one's from a Protestant cemetery, so this is from a grave that was from the 1800s. This is the necropolis in Scotland, and look at all the obelisks. It's just a forest of obelisks. Here's another one. Both of these are from Scotland. And I find this especially interesting. After the Civil War, both sides, Confederates and the Union, decided to make monuments to soldiers. And the monuments for both sides were Egyptian symbols. So here's the Confederate monument in Richmond Cemetery. It's Hollywood Cemetery is what it's called. It's in Richmond, Virginia. And that's where the Daughters of the Confederacy really started this movement to memorialize the Confederate soldiers. And this is the monument that was built in Boston's Mount Auburn Cemetery in memory of the Civil War on the Union side, but both are Egyptian symbols. This is a totally separate grave in Cave Hill Cemetery that's got a big Sphinx on it. And this is actually one here in Lancaster Cemetery. It's a very modern grave, but I really like their epitaph exit. Kind of sums it up, doesn't it? Now let's move to
are you talking about the Lancaster and Garrett County?
Yeah, that's in Garrett County.
Yeah, that's where I'm from. The man that's buried there, he was notorious for going around and checking exit signs because he would work with our local fire department, and it just became like a thing for him.
I did not know that.
I'm from Garrett County.
Well, I live here, but I'm not from here, but I walk there a lot. And I just really like that. I mean, it's just perfect, even if we don't know that story. I mean, Yeah,
I tell people all the time that it's a great place to go and walk the cemetery. And they're like, why? But Lancaster Cemetery is actually a really nice place to go and walk. It's really pretty.
It is. And they have some really beautiful monuments too. So I probably have some more pictures from there in here too. Well, that's good to know. I'm glad you popped in and said that. So let's move on to the ancient Greeks and let's look at the ideas we got from them. So the Mycenaeans, of course, are sort of pre-Greek, but they had these underground tombs. This is the front of one where you entered it, but here's a diagram that shows what it would have looked like inside. And here next to it, I show a style of family crypt that's very similar, right? The crypt itself is in a bank, and then the entrance is over here, and you can't exactly see it. Now, the Greeks could be cremated or they could be buried. They practiced both. But they loved carved statues or two-dimensional reliefs carved in marble or stone to memorialize the dead. The word they used for the upright slabs was a stele or stelae plural. And I've got some pictures in a minute, but it's basically what modern tombstones are. Right now, these could also, a stele could be a word also used for a big monument with words. So, for instance, the Code of Hammurabi in ancient Mesopotamia is a giant stele as well. But these would be, inscribed with epitaphs, pictures, either idealized or realistic, of the deceased person. And the ancient Romans loved that style. They adopted it. And of course, we know the Renaissance, the artists in the Renaissance loved everything Greek and Roman, and they adopted it. In the 17 and 1800s, we have a neoclassical revival, and the wealthy Europeans like to go on the grand tour, and they would collect ancient funeral monuments because, no one was really stopping them. And they would haul home tombstones in this style from Greece or Rome and display them in their homes, museums, and they used them as models for their own tombstones. Now, one difference, though, was they kept the marble white because that is what they saw when they collected these. But originally, most of the Greek ones were painted in bright colors, but they did not do that. So, for instance, here's a Greek crater. So the idea of a funeral urn that people put the ashes of cremated people in, or you'll see urns on graves that don't have ashes in them, but we just like that symbol of a funeral urn. So here's a grave, a modern tombstone with an urn. Sometimes the fabric draped over it is like curtains closing, closing on the play of life. The ancient Greeks in the later period, the Hellenistic period, also constructed mausoleums. What's a mausoleum? I'll get to that in just a second. Here's some ancient Greek tombstones. This is one that had the images painted on it that's barely there. Here's a relief that was carved, and you see parts of it have been broken. And then here's another example. And then this is a modern ancient Greek inspired monument. And look, they even have on ancient Greek or Roman style clothing, but this is modern, I'll say modern, from the 1800s or early 1900s tombstone. A mausoleum, the word comes from a famous Persian king who built this giant tomb for himself, and it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So here's what it looked like over here in the bottom left. There's where Harlequinensis was located, over on the coast of Turkey. And of course, that was all, Greek in culture. Here's all that's left today. But here's some examples of mausoleums. The Taj Mahal, if you Google, 10 most impressive historical mausoleums, the Taj Mahal is always on that list, built in the 1600s by a ruler in India for his late wife. Abraham Lincoln has a family tomb, but I think we could put this in a mausoleum design. Now, he did not build this for himself, but we often will make these very grand monuments for important people. Here's Lenin's mausoleum in Moscow. I don't think they have him on display anymore, but he was embalmed and on display there for decades, the famous communist leader. And then, of course, Napoleon died in exile on an island out in the Atlantic, but later they moved him to Paris, put him in this very grand sarcophagus, and then have this very grand building around it. So you have to, you're wealthy or powerful or important to rate a mausoleum. So what did the ancient Romans, what styles have we adopted from them? Well, again, average people were cremated, or they could be buried, but they were memorialized as well, but just in smaller ways. So think of how average people today, we might have a small tombstone, or we might have a niche with an urn, and average Romans might have that as well. These remains were housed in above ground buildings or cemeteries or above ground buildings or community mausoleums. So think of a mausoleum with sort of niches in it, and then your remains would be in one of those niches. Sometimes they're called columbaria, and I have some pictures of those. And they would have these community rooms where they would have kind of like Memorial Day. You know, today there's still a lot of people that celebrate Memorial Day. Some people will even, Decoration Day, put flowers on graves, may have a meal. And the ancient Romans did that as well. And they had these sort of dedicated spaces in these cemeteries or buildings to do that. So here's a memorial monument with a man and his wife who were freed slaves. And then this is a sarcophagus, obviously of a very wealthy person, because not everyone's going to have a sarcophagus or a stone coffin is that grand. Even the word cemetery comes from ancient Greece, and it means literally a sleeping place. So the Greeks would say cemetery when they meant, yep, that's like where you sleep, but sometimes they would use it for burial sites. And early Christians used this word, but then that word fell out of style and came back in style in the 1800s. And I'll talk about that in just a second. So for instance, a lot of times the memorial art we see will depict people asleep, or they could be dead, they could be asleep. And it really symbolizes Christian beliefs, which are so important in Western culture and related to death, that death is believed to be a temporary state like sleep, and it's to be followed by an afterlife in heaven. So here's a person that could be in his coffin, or he could be asleep. This I found, and I'm not sure what cemetery this came from, but it's a very beautiful sculpture of a woman asleep. And then here's another one. Now this is an angel, but she's asleep, right? And this is in Highgate Cemetery in London. Another word that's used to reference a place where we find memorial art is an necropolis. And in Greek, the prefix necro means death, right? And they used it for the place where you find monuments or graves. And the Greeks and the Romans located these outside the city walls. They thought that the places where dead people should be separated from the homes of the living. Now, remember, cities were much more dense places in the past with walls around them. And later, in Christian practice, a lot of churches were in cities and people were buried in churches or the churchyard, but those become incredibly crowded. So that's part of the story later, is where they're moved outside of the city as well, like Highgate that I mentioned earlier. In the 1800s, they revived the word, right? And the big cemetery in Glasgow, Scotland, up on top of the hill, is called the necropolis. So here you can see a view from there and you can see over the city. Another word that comes from Latin is a columbarium, right? A room or a building where there's niches for funeral urns. Spring Grove Cemetery is a very famous historical cemetery that was established in the 1800s, but they also have a very modern columbarium. And these are two pictures I took from there. So they have some that are marble face niches, and these may have coffins in them. I'm not 100% sure. And then here's niches for the equivalent of a funeral urn for ashes. Here's a picture in Lafayette Cemetery in New Orleans of these type of niches where people would be buried and their names inscribed on there. And this is, these frescoes are actually housed in a museum I visited in Rome, but they were discovered in one of these community columbariums. So this is a picture of this building they discovered from ancient Rome before they took the frescoes down. And you can see the little niches. So the paintings are between the niches, and then they would put like a slab here that would have the person's name on that little half circle. And these are some of the frescoes that were painted between them. And of course they're faded, but just really beautiful images. And there was a huge display of these, and you can see, some of those in the black and white picture. A catacomb, yet another reference to ancient Rome. Now, some people think that catacombs were only Christians, but that's not true. As burials within the city were banned, there was more and more overcrowding and shortage of land. They said, we've got to move these things outside the city. And to save land, they started putting them underground. And the kind of rock that, could you turn your phone off? The kind of rock they have in Rome is real easy to carve. So these are two pictures of Roman catacombs. Now, the ones that are most famous that you can visit outside of Rome today are primarily Christian. And so there were saints buried in these, their bodies, right? So these were actually for the body, because burial of the body was a real important part of Christian faith. Now in Paris, there's a Paris catacomb, and it's on my list of places to go that I haven't been. And this is really not a catacomb. This is a storage for bones of over 6 million people that they relocated from those crowded church cemeteries in the 1700s into these old stone quarries. So a catacomb was really a place where the remains were originally deposited. Now this looks pretty bleak and dull here, the Roman catacombs from ancient Rome, but these would have been decorated. These niches would have had coverings on them. They would have had art. If it was a particularly important person, they might have their own little room, right? So this looks very bare compared to the decorative art we would have seen if we were there when it was being used. A crypt, another reference, right, from Latin, meaning a vault. So here again is a Highgate Cemetery, and then there's a circle of these crypts around this central sort of an island of land with a big tree on it. This shows a modern day picture I found from a place that demonstrates the kind of burial that takes place in a crypt. Of course, crypts are also underneath churches, and so every church of any note in Europe has got a crypt under it, and people were buried, their remains were placed there in coffins. Sometimes they were buried in the church floor, and if you were poor, you were in the consecrated ground outside of the church. Here's some family crypts and mausoleums from cemeteries that were established in the 1800s, and you see Scotland, land is more at a premium, they're squashed together more. Here's the famous cemetery in Philadelphia, and looks like my sign got off there, but here's the crypts, above ground crypts in New Orleans. Now, some people think, oh, in New Orleans, they have to do it this way because the bones float to the top. Not really. And this, as a reference to our monsters last time, is a gargoyle that actually, I'm not sure if it's a rain spout, but he was carved on one of these crypts in Edinburgh. Finally, bone storage memorial places are charnel houses or ossuaries. So the Paris catacombs are really storage houses for bones. And in European tradition, even today, if you are buried, and burial sites are at a premium because they've lived there for so long and buried so many people, you basically are renting that burial site for a period of time, maybe 50 or 100 years, and then they take your bones out of that grave and they put them in these storage houses. So here's a modern Greek ossuary. Here's this one you got to visit if you go to Rome, the Capuchin crypt. So these are all monks that have died, and they make decorative things with the bones. Here's one in Poland. And here you can see, this is from a medieval manuscript, and they're placing an unembalmed, not in a coffin body, in the churchyard, right? And see back here where I added the yellow arrow, there's the charnel house. There's where the people who were buried, but then had to be removed to put new bodies, that's where they are. Finally, there's places that are associated specifically with Christianity. And this is true with any religion, you know, there's specific things related to that faith. But of course, the sepulcher is usually associated with the place where Jesus's body was placed when he was crucified. And then a potter's field is a word used for burial place of poor people. And it derives from the place where Judas was buried, the apostle that turned Christ over for crucifixion. So this is a picture of where the places were that were related to the death of Christ, and then how they built the church over those places. One more, a cenotaph, I have a hard time saying that word, it comes from Greek and Latin too, and it's really more of a monument than a tomb. So it looks like a tomb, but it's a monument or a memorial commemorating people, and it's come to mean commemorating often wars. So here's one commemorating the people who died in the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas. But now this one is in the Richmond Cemetery, and this is a very prominent one by Main Street for Captain James Estill. He did not die here. And in fact, there's some old pieces of tombstone, I think, incorporated in this, but they made this monument about 100 years after his death. So his body is not there. So that would make it a cenotaph. So let's look at some customs that are related to the kind of art. Of course, tombstones, right? But also think about the illuminated manuscripts, right? Because in a Christian illuminated manuscript, death and resurrection is a very important thing. So here's a page of a Christian burial ground. And in the Middle Ages, up until really the late 1700s, people didn't think they were as reverential a place as we do now. They were burying grounds or graveyards. They were not called cemeteries. That word fell out of usage. They were a place you put dead people. They rarely fenced them. They were often not maintained well. They might be even used because it was a space with grass. The animals might graze on it. Often the markers for average people were very basic, very simple: wood, local stone, carved. So here's an example of a body being placed in the grave. And see these little things that look like little triangles? Those are actually a marker, and it's a cross, but it's got a little roof on it. And then here is a what we would also call a Greek stele, a very flat, plain tombstone. This one is in Edinburgh. This is from, I think, the 1700s, early 1800s. But you notice they even call it the burying ground of this guy. A kirk is a churchyard. And before the 1800s, so we're talking about this Christian period from, let's say, the early Middle Ages, maybe 700, all the way up until about the 1700s. There's really different attitude towards death because Christians believed you died, and if you did what you were supposed to do, you went to heaven, and if you didn't, you went to hell. So death to them was an opportunity to remind the living that you better do what you're supposed to do because time is short. And that describes what this Latin phrase, memento mori, it's remember you are dying, or remember you're going to die, and that hell is real. So we're going to warn you to live the way you're supposed to. So a lot of the cemeteries we see are very grim, right? And memento mori symbols, skeletons, crossbones, skulls are probably the most common. These are all from the burying ground in Boston, the oldest cemetery in Boston. And there's whole skeletons on tombstones. And, you know, today we would think, oh, that's creepy. Here's a skull and crossbones. That's not the grave of a pirate. This is a death's head. So it's a skull with wings, right? So hopefully it's ascending to heaven, or that's flying away. This is the hourglass we saw earlier. Time is passing. Take care of your salvation now. Here's a torch held upside down. This is probably Father Time, maybe. Time is passing. Now later, sometimes you'll see one that looks more like an angel, and it's a soul effigy, right? A winged representation of the soul ascending towards heaven. But they're really grim symbols. These are from two different churchyards in Edinburgh. So the same things. Here's a soul effigy. It's a little nicer, but you still get the skull and the hourglass. And right here it even has, see, part of it's missing, memento mori. This is a painting, and there's a lot of memento mori paintings. This is a glass turned over, meaning time's disappeared or spilled. You've spilled time. This is a lamp that's burning out. And this is a particularly strange one. And you see these a lot in churches in Europe. And this is called the cadaver monument, or transi in Latin. And this is where they actually have the deceased as a skeleton. So here's one where on top is this guy who was a knight, right? 7th Earl. And down here is him where he's wasted away in the grave, saying, yep, this is going to happen to you. Here's another one of a woman. So this is the bottom part of her monument. And this is the famous painting by Masaccio, who's, you know, an early Renaissance painter, and it's famous for its perspective. So this is fresco on a wall in a church in Florence. But at the bottom, and you don't always see this part of the painting in our books, is another, you know, it's a skeleton on a tomb, warning you, time is passing, time is passing. So imagine today, I mean, this, no one would have been surprised or shocked by this in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period. But imagine today if you requested a monument with a skeleton on top of it. I mean, that would really freak people out. But in the 17 and 1800s, we start getting these shifting views towards death. We get a more positive view of death because of changes in religion that are becoming more, I'll say, optimistic about the number of people going to heaven. Before this, the Presbyterians, the Calvinists of the Protestant Reformation, were particularly grim with their theory or doctrine of predestination, which only a few elect are going to heaven and everybody else is going to hell. So memento mori, we're really warning you in that faith. But we start moving away from those really pessimistic views of the majority of people going to hell to this belief that, if you do the right thing, you're probably going to get to heaven. And Romanticism also influences this. And this is artistic, literary, and intellectuals, right? So there's literary works in this vein, and then there's a lot of art with very dramatic, emotional scenes. And between this more positive view in religion, this romantic view, we start to see shifts in the kind of art that's produced for memorials. We start using the word cemetery again because we're shifting away from that idea of, yep, that's a burying ground and you're dead and you're probably in hell because you probably didn't do what you were supposed to and we're trying to warn you. We're shifting to this, oh, you know what, you're just sleeping and there's a much better chance you're probably going to go to heaven. So this is a famous sculpture from the Protestant cemetery in Rome, and you see a lot like it, very similar to it. And this is a weeping angel, right? A very romantic, a lot of romantic literature was a sort of tearjerker, like emotion. It's about emotion. It doesn't have to be a positive emotion or love romantic. It's about a lot of emotion. You see lots more angels, and this is a print made from an art print, and you still see this in decorative art in churches today, the guardian angel. And a lot of the literature had an emphasis on dying. So this is where the elegy gets really popular. Goethe was a German writer, and one of the most famous novels of this period was The Sorrows of Young Werther. And it's about this man that, oh God, it's a really horrible book. I read it years ago. This man that falls in love with this woman, unrequited love, and he just dies because she doesn't love him. It's, yeah, whatever. We've kind of got over that romanticism in modern world, I think. All of these poets were famous in this romantic movement, and a lot of their poetry and stories had to deal with death. In Charles Dickens, the old Curiosity Shop, he talks about Little Nell, who was a young girl that died. And he even references, she was dead, but she just looked beautiful and calm, like she was asleep, and we know she's in heaven. There was an emphasis and a whole set of art for children's graves, because there was the idea that children are dying, children are sinless. So on one hand, it's horrible when a child dies because their life is cut short. But on the other hand, they're sinless. So we know they're going to go to heaven. So you see little lambs on children's cemeteries. This one's in Garrett County, and this is marble. Marble erodes away a lot more quickly than granite. And so originally that would have been a much more crisp sculpture. And of course, that's a reference to where Jesus says, bring the little children into me like sheep. And then here's another one. This one's especially unusual. There's not many babies and seashells, but that one's, very poignant, right? The baby looks like it's asleep. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, we know that for the anti-slavery message, but this was also a part of this romantic view of a sinless child teaching us a lesson in her death. And it's the famous scene of the main character, little Eva. And she's dying, and she tells her father, bring all the slaves in because I want to share a memento with them. And, the dad's like, well, they're just slaves. She says, no, they're people too. And I am paraphrasing this, by the way. It goes on for pages and pages. But she says, no, they're people too. And she cuts off her beautiful golden hair and gives them all a piece of her beautiful golden hair to remember her by, but also to remember that they too are worthy to go to heaven. And this was shocking in Harriet Beecher Stowe's work. Not the part about cutting off your hair and giving it as mementos. We'll talk more about that. But the part about letting slaves become a part of a family and someone, people worthy of going to heaven. And so it was a part of that greater message that slavery is a bad thing. Another thing that's depicted in art in this, these shifting views, but depicted in somewhat new ways, is the good death. And this was a concept, right, of how you should die. But here's a depiction. This was a print that people would have purchased and hung on their wall, the death of George Washington, right? And here's his family members around him. In other words, this is a depiction of this idea of the good death. What was the good death? Well, the idea started way before George Washington died. It goes back to the early modern period in the Middle Ages, that there's a certain way you should die. There's rules of conduct, and you should follow sort of these rules. And this is a medieval woodcut, right, from the rules of dying, one of the Latin texts. Well, what were these rules? Well, it was expected behavior, especially in the middle class. We see it a lot during the Civil War, right? So my print here is from Harper's Weekly, sort of a newspaper publication that printed engravings, and it helps to depict the good death and the role of women in this. So first of all, when you're dying, you have to be brave. You can't whine. You have to accept death. You have to keep in mind that without modern medical care, death could be very long and very horrible. You're dying among your family because they were supposed to be there to assemble around your deathbed. They comfort you, but they also assess your spiritual condition so they can say, yep, so-and-so went to heaven. And they hear your last words, and your last words were super important because your last words were supposed to help characterize how you lived your life. And again, lessons to the people who were still around you. And kind of like memento mori, right? They're lessons to remind people that they too will die, but they tended to be maybe a little more positive. It was victory, right? So this person is going to die and they're going to live in the ever after. And of course, it's a very religious viewpoint, right? And it's similar to the story of Jesus's salvation. And then there would be stories told about people who were inspired by the last words of another person, or they were saved in a religious sense, right? This is a major theme in 19th century literature. And of course, the Civil War, with all the death that occurs, just helps to bring it out. It's in fiction, it's in pictures, it's in books, magazines, poems about it. Pictures about it are in scrapbooks. You see it on tombstones, songs, it's everywhere. So here's two more prints, right? The death of Andrew Jackson, the death of President Lincoln, and it's a depiction of the good death, where your family is around you and you're going to utter those last words to be a model for the future. There was a famous novel called The Gates Ajar, published in 1868. It was a bestseller. No one's heard of it today. We have heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin because of its anti-slavery message, but today modern readers would not enjoy this. Again, I skimmed this one. It's really horrible because it's so sentimental and in that romantic good death vein. But it's about a woman who is a widow because her husband died in the Civil War, and another woman whose brother died in the Civil War. And for this entire long novel, they talk about how they should be brave because their soldiers were brave, and how their soldiers are in heaven. And the gates are standing ajar, just waiting to welcome them someday, and they could be with their loved ones. That's the thesis of the book. It was so popular that there were songs written about the gates ajar. There was art about the gates ajar. This is a cemetery sculpture based on the book of the gates ajar. It started to be used as cemetery symbolism. And some of these are historic gates ajar, all right, from different cemeteries, but this is a very new tombstone with the gates ajar. Here's one you could order from a catalog in the early 20th century. These three are from Lancaster Cemetery, modern, with the gates ajar. So it shows how a novel and popular culture and cemetery and memorial art all became wrapped up together. Here's some of the music, mourning music that shows these symbols, mourning at the grave of loved ones. So, oh my gosh. Okay, I know I'm talking fast. In this cemetery that depicts this new view towards death that starts in the late 1700s, and they start building these cemeteries in the early 1800s. The first one is Père Lachaise in Paris. And then London builds them. Then all the American cities have to have one. These are Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee in this style, and they're called rural or garden cemeteries. They're no longer churchyards because to be buried there, you had to be that denomination of that church. They're more like the equivalent today where you would buy a family plot for your family members. You could buy individual plots as well. And you would put these grand monuments that had these symbols of this sort of romantic view of death. And they were beautiful, and every family plot was landscaped by the family. So every family plot was like its own little garden with fences around it. Now today, modern lawnmowers, time has passed. So the beauty of a lot of these has been lost, and only the monuments are left. Mount Auburn in Boston was the first one. And look, it still has an Egyptian revival gate. And they were so popular that they would print tourist books. So you could go and stroll the lovely winding streets and you could view the beautiful monument. And here's some of the factors, right, that helped to contribute to this movement. So Cave Hill in Louisville, Spring, the one in Cincinnati I mentioned, even the Richmond Cemetery remodeled on this style. So any town that was anybody had to have one of these. And so they might move graves from the old cemetery, or they might start one in this new style, or they might start a new part of a cemetery in this new style. And often pride in the community was a very prominent place. So for instance, Frankfurt's up on top of a hill. It's in this style, Frankfurt Cemetery. And of course, lots of governors buried there. In Kentucky, the Lexington Cemetery is an excellent example of style. And these are floor plans, I'll say, showing the curvy streets, right? Here's Cave Hill, Lexington, and the one in Richmond. This is the modern part over here, because when the lawnmower was invented, this style also was falling out of style anyway, and lawnmowers want you to mow things straight, right? So you can see these all over, basically everywhere east of the Mississippi. Every town has one, and I make it my point to go to as many as possible. So mourning art wasn't just what was carved on your tombstone, right? It was prints. There were lots of mementos, needlework. People would make mourning pictures. You'll see lots of weeping willows, because what a better symbol, right? A weeping tree. You'll see urns. All of these have urns, Greek symbol. You'll have stelae, right? Greek model. And evergreens are popular in cemeteries. Look, there's an obelisk. People kept scrapbooks of clippings, hair of deceased people. Photographs were taken of deceased people. And my favorite, I love the needlework. In fact, I scored a 1833 mourning needlework. It's about, oh gosh, 15 by 20. It's not perfect tradition on eBay, one of my most prized possessions. But hair work, and I also like it. So what you would do is you would take the hair of the deceased and you would make things out of it. And this has become, you see more about this. Some of it was like a home craft project. So now it didn't always have to be deceased people. You could also make this from your, hair of your friends, your family members, but a lot of it had to do with the deceased. So here's these common symbols: the urn, the monument, the people mourning, and the tree, the weeping willow tree, that's someone's hair. This one of Jesus and the people becoming angels, that is where they would melt the hair and make sort of a paint. There's also mourning jewelry that used jet, which is a black sort of stone or mineral, and you would see that a lot. But these woven looking things, that's hair, and you would send that away to a jeweler who would do this weaving and then use these, make gold or silver mounts for it. This is from a catalog, so you could pick out what you wanted here, the design you wanted, and then you would send the hair of your loved one or deceased loved one, and then they would create that jewelry for you to wear. This one is another, see the tree, and that's hair. Here in Kentucky, we have this famous quilt, and this is at the Kentucky Historical Society, called the Graveyard Quilt. And this lady made this in the 1840s, and these are family members whose names are on these coffins in the cemetery. And then she has a typical quilt design, and then around the edge is a fence. And evidently these coffins are the people who haven't died yet. And she would move you to the graveyard when you died. We probably need to make one of those. Freak our relatives out, wouldn't it? So death shifts But by the Civil War, they started bombing people, and also we get industrialization and commercialization. So death also becomes part of a profitable industry. So now we're not making our own hair wreaths like we might have in the late 17, early 1800s. Now we might buy someone's services to make it for us. There's also a whole industry in the goods for mourning. You can find catalogs on archive.org of metal benches, fountains, urns that you could use on your family funeral plot. You'll find catalogs of monuments that you could purchase. So for instance, this is an iron funeral urn that's in a cemetery, and they put some plants in it. Here's some examples of angels from catalogs. So if you walk around cemeteries, you might say, oh my gosh, I've seen that angel before. That's because they ordered it from a catalog, and then it was delivered and put up in their local cemetery. And a lot of this comes from Vermont. There's a huge granite quarries there, so that's sort of a center. But a lot of limestone is carved around Bedford, Indiana, too. So really quickly, let's talk a little bit about some of the symbols. My personal favorite is the tree stone. So this is carved limestone in this marble. So these tend to be limestone. Most monuments we see today are granite, but then the ones that erode are often white marble. Now, a lot of people say, oh, every flower and every plant symbolizes something specific. And that's sort of a myth because the meaning, we've used plants to symbolize things ever since we've been humans. So what ivy might have meant to an ancient Greek might have been different to a Roman, might have been different in the Middle Ages, might be different today. And we just like it because it's pretty. And this historian, Beverly Seton, wrote a book. She researched these books that were published. They were super popular in the 1800s of the language of flowers. And a red rose means this, and a white rose means this, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of people took it very literally, but actually what she discovered is, you know, every book has something slightly different, and people were really into gardening and flowers, and they're sort of gift books. They were sort of fun things to have, but there was no set language of flowers. Like, for instance, this lady may have picked this wreath on her husband's memorial because she liked flowers, right? It may not have had a specific symbol. Some flowers go through phases. And some are fairly specific, like thistles often reference Scotland, but not always. Roses can mean a billion different things. Lilies still somewhat have a Christian association because they're often a symbolic of the crucifixion, especially medieval art, that's for sure. Calla lilies went through a really popular period in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And I think, you know, they go through periodic popularity periods for weddings. Trees, again, what does a tree symbolize? Well, which religion are you talking about? Which tree are we talking about? Are we talking about the tree of life, the Garden of Eden? Are we talking about a family tree? Here's a very modern tombstone from the Lancaster Cemetery, and it has a tree, and it says the roots of a family tree, so they must be referencing the family tree. But here's, you know, you can pick your headstone out on a website today, and here's all the trees you can pick from. So if I put a palm tree on my tombstone, is that a symbol of, in Christianity, that would have been a symbol of Palm Sunday before the crucifixion? Or does it mean I like the beach, right? So it's hard to say what these mean. Tree stones, the weeping willows are often associated with cemeteries, but I don't know that people recognize that so much anymore. The story behind a weeping willow, here's some, and you see these on the late 1700s, early 1800s monuments. You see them in a lot of the rural cemeteries. The story behind them is Napoleon was supposed to have died under a weeping willow tree in the early 1800s. And then weeping willows were popular in gardening anyway. They were an import from Asia. So people just put together mourning and weeping willow, and it really went well. There's another kind of stone, and you'll see some of these in just about every cemetery, called the tree stone from the late 1800s up until the 20s. And these are like tree trunks. And what do they mean? Well, they were really stylish. They were a part of the rustic style that was popular. It's associated with the arts and crafts movement, but they also could have symbolized a group called the Woodmen of the World, which was a sort of like an insurance association that could sell you a death insurance, or we call it life insurance today. And that policy included a tombstone. And that tombstone you could select from a catalog. And since they were the woodmen of the world, some of those were tree stones, but it was just a popular style. And the center of the tree stone is Bedford, Indiana, because they're usually carved limestone. So I took a special trip to Bloomington and Bedford and Indianapolis. I've got a million tree stone pictures, tree benches, tree chairs, tree fences. This is the best one. This one's in Virginia. Like they got a tree fence. They got the main family tree. Here's some more. There's all sorts. So, people picked them because they liked them and they were popular, just like things had fads today. Here's some of the woodmen of the world you could pick through the catalog. And some of them you will see the woodmen of the world symbol carved on those. And not all the woodmen of the world ones were trees, right? So I'm almost out of time. This is what I want you to think about. Now, warning, this may not be suitable for your students, right? And you may, because I don't know that you want to suggest to students that they're going to die. So you use your own judgment, but it's interesting to think about in a retrospect of thousands of years of symbolism and similar forms that we've used over and over and over and over and over again in Western culture. Think about how you want to be remembered. And do you think in terms of the types of art forms and memorials that we've talked about today? So if you were to design your own memorial, what would the media be? Now, I've already said, I want a tree stone. I've already found people that still do tree stones, and I'm tempted to just go ahead and buy it and put it up in my yard to admire it because I want to look at it before I die. But would you rather have something made of another media? What symbols would you choose? Would they be symbolic, or would they be things that actually something you like in your life? Because there's a lot of dogs on cemeteries. People like their dogs. What would your epitaph be? What would be the words? What would your obituary say? Because all of this is really an art form. It's a thing we've done throughout history. And again, I've talked about Western traditions, but every culture has these kind of traditions. So for example, my favorite epitaph, and I would love to have a version of this, and I have shortened it, is from a 3rd century AD stone. It's an ancient Roman epitaph, and I love a tree stone. This one's from Danville, but I would have symbols or images that are relevant to me. So what would you pick? And what does it say about your place at the end of a long story about how we have memorialized the dead? And, people think like the hair jewelry is weird. I thought I had a slide here of it. I guess I took it out. But you can go to websites today where you can have jewelry and all sorts of things, paperweights, pictures made from someone's funeral ashes or from someone's DNA. You see memorial stickers on people's car windows. So we still do lots of things that say someone in the 1800s would have thought. We do things they would have thought weird to memorialize people, just like today, saving someone's hair seems strange. This is a book that has lots of images. It was published in the 1920s, but lots of really good images of different types of tombstones. And this is an old lesson plan, but it's about memorials from different cultures. And it's a pretty good lesson plan. I had some neat ideas if you want to do something. Of course, this is the topic of one of my books, but if you want to learn more about how people looked at death differently during the Civil War, this book is excellent. And it's also a PBS American Experience show. So that was really fast. Oh, and if you want to learn more about tree stones and Egyptomania, I've got a blog on both of those. So you can read those on my blog. So, oh my gosh, I got 1 minute left. Questions, comments, ideas? Would you want to try this with your students or not? Because remember, don't go out and do it because I said to. You have to know your students and your students' parents to know if this is appropriate. I did have my future teachers one time write their retirement epitaph. In other words, when you retire from teaching, what do you want people to remember about you? To think about what we had been talking about in class, like what makes a good teacher and what do you want to be that people will remember you about? So, turn on your mic, turn on your chat, questions, comments, ideas. Then I'll put the PowerPoint in the folder after we finish. But a lot of ideas for teaching art through time, for teaching how symbols get reused, but with different meanings. Yeah, a POC for, I know it's professional learning community, but like for kids to do, Debbie, or is that something kids do, or is this something?
No, just teachers. It'd be a fun thing to do at a teachers meeting.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. What do you want to, what's your retirement epitaph going to be?
Oh, good. I'm never going to retire.
Oh,
I'm going to be popping wheelies on my little scooter down the hallways of PES.
oh, you're very positive. I admire it. Well, here's the link. There's the preview quiz. There's a link to the Google folder, and I'll put this in there after we finish.
Thank you.
Anything else? Anybody?
I believe the more I know, the more I'm confused by the symbolisms and then of course it becomes commercialized, and then it's like no holds barred anymore, you know. But the thing that intrigues me the most are the storage of the bones, the storage of the skulls, because they're just all in there together.
Yeah, that is really weird for Americans. And the English didn't do this really. They don't really do charnel houses so much either in history. But I think a part of it is where land was at a premium, you know, where Europeans have been living in cities and small countries for, you know, thousands of years. You can't have a permanent forever place for someone. And it really makes sense, because how many cemeteries that are 100 years old, so like family cemeteries across Kentucky, they're forgotten. All right. And the last person may have been buried there just 80, maybe 100, maybe 70 years ago. So really our living memory doesn't last much longer than 100 years. So why use that? Why not reuse the space? Those crypts that I showed you at Highgate Cemetery, I got to take a tour of that. And the tour guide said, you know, in England, it's incredibly expensive to have a space to bury someone in a cemetery. And so they thought, oh my gosh, half of these crypts are half empty. Like some family member bought this and said, this is where everybody's going to be buried in my family forever. And then they were forgotten about. No one used it. So they did the research to contact the descendants of the people who had purchased these family crypts to say, you know, if you want to be buried, we've got a spot for you and it's free because your ancestor already paid for it. And no one, you know, they couldn't find people. And that cemetery was established, I think it was the 1830s. So it's really not that long ago, but yet we forget very quickly. And all those rural cemeteries around London had fallen into disrepair. A lot of the one I visited is still very grown up because, you know, they fall out of style and then people don't take care of them. So it kind of makes sense to reuse it. Of course, there's a new movement to actually green burial, where they don't put you in a coffin and they let you decompose in the ground like they did in the Middle Ages. But now there's this new thing where they actually compost bodies. They have a composter for human bodies, so they can use you for basically fertilizer. But yeah, symbols get reused, reinterpreted, forgotten, and much more quickly. The life cycle of a symbol, I think, goes pretty quickly today with modern media. Anything else? Our time is up.